What did we read in Romans 5? Go ahead and open that up again. Romans 5. In verses 6 through 9. For when we were yet without strength, in due time, or according to the time, Christ died for the ungodly, you and I. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man some would even dare to die. But God commends his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, being now justified by his blood, we shall be what? Saved from wrath through him. So with Christ's sacrifice, what are we saved from? Wrath. What does that mean? Christ saves us. And just think for a minute, apart from this verse, what does he save us from? Sin? Eternal separation? The consequences of sin? We could say that a number of different ways. Present and future applications. Right? And is it just a physical thing? Okay. And you have to understand, I can't talk up here if people out here aren't talking. I can't work that way. Can we appreciate Christ's sacrifice if we don't understand what he sacrificed? Or what he suffered? It says here in Romans that Christ died for us and he saved us from the wrath that would have been ours. So what did Christ suffer? The wrath. Right? Christ suffered the wrath. Wrath of God. What does all this mean? What do we associate with wrath or the consequence of sin? What pictures do we have in our minds? Hellfire and damnation. Maybe a little brimstone thrown in there. A few screams, wails. Angry faces. There's all, people make lots of... Yes, Dennis.
The question I have is, usually when families get into arguments, they're silent. Usually that indicates their wrath or their hate. And so, could God's wrath be his separation or his silence to a sinner?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. And we'll look at this a little more in depth as we go through.
Most families, though, when they're fighting, get more intense.
So whether... I think we all understand. So wrath can be shown in different ways, right? Sometimes it's escalating volume, sometimes it's silence, but almost always there's this ugly face, right? Interesting. Lightning and thunder, we associate with wrath. So where do we see this most clearly? The cross. The cross is the culmination of the whole gospel, right? Everything before, past, it's the culmination. It's the clearest revelation of God and his plan of salvation. So if we want to understand this, we need to go to the cross to understand what Christ sacrificed for us. What this wrath is that he took in our place, that we no longer have to suffer. So let's look at this a little bit different. And kind of keep in mind, but over on one side, this kind of classical picture of the wrath of God. People always make jokes about heaven or hell and, the screaming people being tormented or whatnot. I would suggest that perhaps we have a wrong conception of the wrath of God, maybe influenced by our culture. Let's take a look at this. But as we do this, as we look at the cross, let's kind of put it in the setting of today. Turn with me to the book of Revelation. And there's some pretty strong language in the book of Revelation. Some of this gets a bit graphic. Turn to Revelation 14. What is our message to the world at this point in time? What do we talk about? The three angels' messages, right? Well, how often do we talk about the third angel's message? Come on, you got to talk to me. We talk about the third angel's lots? Not the bad part? We leave the bad part out, right? Well, let's look at it. Verse 9, and the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And it goes on. Does that sound very pretty? It's pretty powerful. Now, what is wrath? Let's just take a look at the word wrath. Okay, if you look up the word wrath here in Strong's Concordance, it says the following. It defines it as passion, as if breathing hard. It can be translated fierceness, indignation, or wrath. It was really interesting. I was looking up some other things, and Vine's Expository Dictionary talks about how these words that are translated wrath originally meant a natural desire or a natural disposition, and came to be used in the context of anger because it was a kind of a strong emotion. It was intense. But it also has the connotation of a natural process, which is very interesting. But inherently, it just means passion, a strong feeling, not necessarily what we think of as anger. Okay, if you go down in verse 10, the word indignation, if you look that up in the Strong's, it means desire as a reaching forth or excitement of the mind. Also passion or ire or justifiable abhorrence. Okay? So in and of itself, the words used in the Bible basically just mean a passion, a strong emotion, which may or may not be what we think of as anger. Okay, that's very important to keep in mind. So we have expressed here and elsewhere in the Bible, there is a strong, passionate emotion taking place, a very strong feeling of some sort. In this setting, in Revelation 14, this is a pretty strong warning. There's some not very pleasant things that may happen in the process here. But the message that we have in giving the three angels' messages, how important is it that we understand the wrath of God? Very important. Life or death. What are we telling people? Are we telling people, you better go to church on the right day of the week or God's going to toast you really good? You don't shape up or God's going to be really ticked and He's going to let you have it? What are we telling the world? Yes.
If we tell truth, the truth has its own merit. Just because it's true doesn't degrade it because the fact is true.
I agree. I don't think I quite follow that, but yes.
Yeah, well, shouldn't we be saying here, if you don't follow God, He's going to be broken hearted? Because He's going to be separated from you?
Good question. And I think as we look at Calvary, this is going to become clearer. We're not going to have time to get into a lot of the details, but I hope we can clarify the overall picture a bit. I'll leave it to you to study further. So let's look at Calvary and the life of Christ. Christ's representation of the Godhead, Himself and the Father. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. What made Jesus angry? If we talk about anger, what made Jesus stirred up and caused Him to feel strong passion? Abuses? Okay, of the temple. Describe that a little more. Why?
What was to be called a house of prayer had become a place of robbery, and people were being violated.
People were being violated. He was upset. He cleansed the temple. But why is really, really important. Was God sitting up there and saying, you haven't been treating my house in the way I want? Was He concerned more about the house or more about the people? The effect it was having on the people? The people weren't seeing who God truly was? So people were coming to this sanctuary to interact with God, to worship Him, and they were being diverted or detoured, so to speak. God is really over here like this, you got to pay up. And
When Jesus used the phrase, den of thieves, He was talking about they weren't just robbing people as far as money was concerned, but they were robbing them of what the true picture of God should be.
okay. Who were Jesus' strongest denunciations of, and why? He got up on his stump in the marketplace and really let the harlots have it, right?
Yes and no, because primarily I would say that he was strong denunciations was about the sinners and denial. In other words, people who were not denying the fact that they were sinners, and yet sinners who wanted to come to him in repentance, he made a very differentiation difference between them.
Those who realize their sinfulness. Good. Good. The scribes and the Pharisees. I don't find a whole lot about the bad people in his denunciations, which is really interesting. And makes me have to stop and think.
After all this, when it was all over, who was left in the temple?
Yes. That is a wonderful point. When Christ cleansed the temple, who ran away and who stayed? All the money changers, the scribes, the Pharisees, split. They couldn't stand it. And who stayed? It was the children. And the common people that were seeking God.
People who were hurting, the people who had problems.
Yeah. Interesting. And as you look at more of these kind of details, what starts to come out, you have the people that are focused on behaviors. They're religious, but they're focused on behaviors at the expense of people. Those are the people that get the strongest rebuke from Christ. The people that are bad, but that are willing to listen and to learn truth, what is really truth, what God is really like, what it means to follow Him. You don't find hardly anything as far as any kind of rebuke, but lots of encouragement. So we have a behavior focus versus a people focus, which really starts to come out. Do you know there's only one place in the Gospels that speaks of anger in reference to Christ? There's places like the cleansing of the temple where we infer it, but there's only one place the Bible actually speaks of it. Turn to Mark 3. Mark 3, 1 through 5. And he entered again into the synagogue, and there was a man there which had a withered hand. And they watched him, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. And he said to the man which had the withered hand, Stand forth. And he said to them, Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days, or to do evil, to save life, or to kill? But they held their peace. Again, we have a behavior versus a person issue. And when he had looked round about on them with anger, and why? Being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, Stretch forth your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored, whole as the other. The only time in the Gospels it talks about Christ being angry was because the religious leaders were more concerned about keeping the Sabbath holy according to their concepts. Not that the Sabbath isn't holy. It very much is. Hey, you didn't keep my rules, or whatever. It was the hardness of their hearts. Okay, let's look at what Christ suffered. If you look at Christ, when did his final suffering begin? Pilate's judgment hall? What was that? Gethsemane. Why do you say Gethsemane?
He would have died there when he was intervention.
I don't remember anyone stabbing him with a sword. Why would he have died in Gethsemane? He was by himself, wasn't he? He couldn't even keep his disciples awake with him. He was with God the Father, bearing the sins of the world. Where was the fire and brimstone? What do you mean bearing the sins of the world? Okay, he had suffering because his disciples wouldn't stay with him? Yes.
But how could he have bear the sins of the world without God separating his love from him?
Okay, so I'm trying to bring this out. What was happening in Gethsemane?
God is withdrawing his presence.
Okay, God was withdrawing his presence. Now, Christ suffered what for us? Wrath. And what was that? God was withdrawing his presence? Is this starting to get a little bit clearer? And I wish we had a little more time to explain this a little bit better. But Christ cried out in the Garden of Gethsemane. I mean, he was praying, he was falling on the ground, he was sweating blood. I mean, talk about strain, an emotional upset, another kind of passion. That's pretty intense. That is pretty intense. When he was on the cross, what did he cry out? My God, why have you forsaken me? Some of the prophecies talk about how silent he was. One of the few things he said was, why have you forsaken me? And what's really interesting, I would encourage you to look at this later in Desire of Ages. It is beautiful. It is beautiful. And you will find, even starting, and I would encourage you specifically to go through the 2 chapters, one on Gethsemane and one on Calvary, and pull out all the words and phrases that describe what Christ was experiencing. Because Christ suffered the wrath of God. What is that wrath, is the question. You will find that in those chapters. And just in the first page on the chapter in Gethsemane, here's a few words. Heart so full of sorrow, he seemed to be shut out from the light of God's sustaining presence. Guilt, dreadful, the weight of guilt, fear, that he would be shut out forever from his Father's love, feeling how terrible is the wrath of God against transgression. My soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. Sad, strange sadness deepened, suffering under the pressure of a terrible burden. That's just the first page. And you go through and it continues with that in both chapters, all through. There's not fire, there's not brimstone. That well may be fact in the end. I don't have any problem with that. But it's not the crucial point. It's not the essence. There is a physical manifestation, but the ultimate manifestation is the spiritual one. And it talks about one thing that was amazing in the chapter, let's see, where was it? I think it talks about how the angels marveled as they watched the Father withdrawing his beams of light and love, basically withdrawing his presence from Christ. They just stood there in shock and amazement. How can this be? How can the Father do this? In Zechariah 13:7, it talks about, "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd and the man that is my fellow." The Father referring to Christ and the process that took place. The wrath of God. Now, as Christ was on the cross, what was the Father's attitude? The Father's up there with his lightning bolts, just throwing them as thick and fast as he can, right? Yes. Right there with Christ, but his presence was completely hidden from Christ. What effect would it have had on Jesus if his presence had been revealed? You know what the Desire of Ages says? He was not to be comforted with his Father's presence. He would have been comforted. Wait a minute. I thought he was suffering the full manifestation of God's wrath. You mean he would have been comforted with the Father's presence?
Could he have died if the Father had been present?
It's a good question. It says he would have been comforted mentally. In some way he was suffering this wrath. Now, is the wrath of God active or passive? This is something that's been a struggle for me, and I've thought a lot about. I've heard all kinds of different ideas. Does God, turn up the temperature? Does he just withdraw life? What does he do? Does he just stand back and let people have their natural consequences? Does he actively step up and zap them? That's the conclusion I've come to. The answer is yes. No matter how you cut it, no matter how you look at it, either God did something, or he could have done something, he didn't do something, or he could have kept it from happening. Ultimately, God is responsible. And there's many cases in the Bible where things are attributed to God that he didn't really do. Like with Job, they attributed to God these terrible things happening. We know God didn't do it, but he did allow it, didn't he? God's not afraid to take the responsibility. But he wants us to understand what is wrath. What is his wrath all about? We'll touch on two more things. The people that were loyal to Christ through his passion, who were they? The religious leaders? They knew he was teaching correct doctrine? Who was loyal to Christ during his suffering? The women? It wasn't just women. They were some of the foremost, true. John the Beloved was at the cross. His mother, Mary Magdalene, the women. Many who had been healed. Who else came forward at this time? Okay. What about after he was actually dead? Joseph of Arimathea? Nicodemus? What did these people have to gain at this point? Okay, did they know that if they stood up for Jesus at this time, they were going to be saved? Is that why they were doing it? I've got to be true to the end and stand for what's right.
And yet at this time, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus
Yes.
They understood everything he had said to them previously. And they said, he is the Son of God.
Things were clicking, coming together. These people, the one common thread, they had zero to gain, but they loved Christ. Joseph had nothing to gain but ridicule and scorn, rejection, probably going to be excommunicated. Christ was dead. Looked like things were over. He came forward. He got Christ's body. He took it to his own tomb. He loved Christ. Yeah, they were risking their own lives in that process. Absolutely. Yes, he was basically alone in his suffering, part of the prophecy. In Desire of Ages, page 825, this is the most concise description of the wrath of God. And this kind of blew me away when I first read this, because I'd always had this different conception of the wrath of God. Listen to this. It talks about angels and their perception and feelings of how man has treated God and his gift. But it gives an illustration. How would a father and mother feel did they know that their child, lost in the cold and the snow, had been passed by and left to perish by those who might have saved it? Would they not be terribly grieved, wildly indignant? Would they not denounce those murderers with wrath, hot as their tears, intense as their love? That's the illustration of God's wrath. So what is his wrath? And it's an expression of his love. It is driven by his love, just like a mother and father with their child. I would invite you, as we prepare to do the foot washing, to think about that and look at your own heart. Not in the context specifically of behavior, but look for hardness. Is there a need for hard things in our heart to be removed, to be taken care of? That we do not rightfully bring about God's indignation? Not that he's angry at us, but he does feel passionately because he loves us and those around us that we interact with. And it grieves him when any of us treat the other with hardness, or that is in our hearts.